Consciousness Explained by Daniel Dennett is a groundbreaking work that aims to unravel the complex nature of human consciousness through a scientific and philosophical lens. Dennett challenges traditional views that treat consciousness as a mysterious, unified thing and instead presents it as a dynamic, multifaceted process resulting from brain activity. Using his theory of the multiple drafts model, he argues that consciousness arises from various parallel interpretations and narratives the brain constructs, rather than from a single central experience. The book combines insights from cognitive science, neuroscience, and philosophy to demystify how we perceive ourselves as conscious beings, offering a naturalistic explanation that bridges mind and body. Daniel Dennett is an influential American philosopher, cognitive scientist, and writer renowned for his work on the philosophy of mind, consciousness, and evolutionary biology. He is a co-director of the Center for Cognitive Studies at Tufts University and has authored several important books that explore how human cognition and consciousness can be understood through scientific inquiry. Known for his clear, engaging style and rigorous arguments, Dennett has been a leading voice in debates about the nature of mind, free will, and artificial intelligence, making complex ideas accessible to both academic and general audiences. Daniel Dennett's Consciousness Explained opens by addressing what he calls the hard problem of consciousness, the question of how and why we have subjective experiences or qualia. Dennett acknowledges that consciousness feels mysterious and deeply personal, but he challenges the idea that it is a single, unified phenomenon that requires special explanation. Instead, he approaches consciousness as a natural process that arises from the brain's complex activities, which can be studied scientifically. Dennett begins by critiquing the traditional assumption that there is a central place in the brain where it all comes together to create a unified conscious experience, a concept he terms the Cartesian theater. This idea imagines a kind of mental screen on which a homunculus, a little observer inside the brain, watches a coherent, continuous movie of sensory input and thoughts. Dennett argues that this metaphor is misleading and ultimately fails to explain consciousness, as it simply shifts the problem to another unexplained observer inside the mind. Instead, Dennett proposes that consciousness is better understood as a set of multiple, parallel processes happening simultaneously in the brain. These processes interpret sensory data, generate internal narratives, and compete for attention without converging in a single central place. He introduces the multiple drafts model, in which there is no fixed, final version of conscious experience, but rather various versions or drafts of sensory and cognitive interpretations that the brain constantly revises and updates. Dennett also emphasizes the importance of evolutionary biology in understanding consciousness. He argues that consciousness is an adaptive trait shaped by natural selection to enhance survival, by enabling flexible, context-sensitive behavior. Rather than being a mystical or inexplicable phenomenon, consciousness emerges from millions of years of biological development and the brain's complex architecture. Throughout the introduction, Dennett stresses the need to abandon folk psychological intuitions, common-sense notions about a unified self or a theater of experience, and instead embrace a scientific approach grounded in neuroscience, cognitive science, and computer modeling. He aims to provide a bridge between philosophy and empirical science, offering an explanation of consciousness that is both rigorous and compatible with current knowledge about the brain. By reframing consciousness as a dynamic, decentralized process rather than a singular entity, Dennett sets the stage for his detailed exploration of perception, cognition, and the self in subsequent chapters. His approach challenges readers to rethink long-held assumptions and invites them to see consciousness not as a problem to be solved by introspection alone, but as a phenomenon to be dissected and explained through careful scientific inquiry. In this part, Daniel Dennett dives deeper into critiquing traditional views of consciousness, especially the pervasive Cartesian theater metaphor. The Cartesian theater imagines a central place in the mind where all sensory information and mental activities come together to be observed by a little inner self or homunculus. Dennett argues this model is flawed because it relies on a hidden observer inside the brain, which leads to an infinite regress. If there's an inner observer who observes that observer's experience and so on, Dennett dismantles this by emphasizing that no such central observer exists. Instead, the brain processes information through multiple parallel pathways, without any single stage where everything converges. This means consciousness is not a single unified stream, but a collection of processes and interpretations competing and collaborating within the brain. He further critiques the idea of qualia, the supposed ineffable, subjective, raw feels of experience, like the redness of red or the pain of a headache. Dennett challenges the assumption that qualia are distinct, irreducible entities that need special explanation. He proposes that what we call qualia are better understood as representations and interpretations produced by the brain's cognitive systems, which are accessible to scientific study. Dennett also examines thought experiments that have traditionally been used to argue for the special, inexplicable nature of consciousness, such as the Mary's Room scenario and the zombie thought experiments. He argues that these rely on intuitions about consciousness that break down when scrutinized from a scientific perspective. Instead of being separate from physical processes, consciousness emerges from complex interactions within neural networks. In rejecting these traditional views, Dennett introduces the notion that consciousness is a user illusion, much like the desktop metaphor in computing. The brain presents a simplified, accessible interface to a complex, distributed system of neural processes. This interface helps the organism function, but doesn't reflect a singular, unified self behind the scenes. This critique paves the way for Dennett's alternative theory, the multiple drafts model, which he elaborates on in the following section. The model replaces the Cartesian theater with a decentralized, dynamic process of ongoing narrative construction. Dennett insists this model better fits what neuroscience reveals about brain function and avoids the conceptual pitfalls of earlier philosophical theories. In this section, Daniel Dennett introduces his central contribution to the study of consciousness, the multiple drafts model. This model fundamentally rejects the idea of a single, unified experience or final draft of consciousness, replacing it with a dynamic, decentralized process of multiple interpretations occurring in parallel within the brain. Dennett explains that the brain continuously receives sensory inputs and processes them through various neural pathways simultaneously. Instead of creating one fixed narrative, the brain generates several drafts of interpretation, different versions of what is happening around and within us. These drafts can be edited, revised, or discarded over time, and no single version holds absolute primacy. Because these drafts coexist and are updated asynchronously, there is no central point where consciousness happens. Rather, consciousness emerges from the competition and interaction among these drafts. What we experience as conscious awareness is not a singular story, but a constantly shifting, composite result of many parallel processes. Dennett likens this to multiple editors working on overlapping drafts of a text, where different versions exist simultaneously, and the final version is never fixed. The audience for this text is not a homunculus or inner observer, but the brain itself as it integrates and acts on these multiple narratives. This idea dismantles the Cartesian theater and eliminates the need for a central self watching the mental movie. The multiple drafts model also accounts for phenomena like change blindness and postdictive effects, where our conscious experience lags behind or selectively incorporates sensory information. Because drafts are constantly being revised, what we consciously perceive can depend on information that arrives later, demonstrating that consciousness is more of a fluid, constructed process than a real-time playback. Dennett highlights that this model aligns well with discoveries in neuroscience, showing that different brain regions process sensory information independently and communicate with each other in complex ways. It also fits with psychological experiments showing how attention, memory, and perception interact dynamically. Importantly, Dennett stresses that consciousness should be understood as an active interpretive process rather than a passive screen. The brain does not simply receive sensory data. It constructs and interprets it, weaving these multiple drafts into the stories we live by. This construction happens without a singular point of control, distributed across many systems working in concert. The multiple drafts model also reframes the notion of the self. Instead of a fixed, unitary I, Dennett suggests the self as a kind of center of narrative gravity, a useful abstraction arising from the brain's storytelling processes. The self is a product of ongoing drafts and edits, not a pre-existing entity observing experience. This section sets the foundation for Dennett's further exploration of how perception, memory, and cognition contribute to consciousness, and how the brain's architecture supports this complex, multi-layered process. In this part, Dennett explores how perception, cognition, and brain processes come together to create conscious experience within the framework of the multiple drafts model. He explains that sensory information does not simply flow in and get recorded as is. Instead, it undergoes complex processing and interpretation across many brain areas. Dennett discusses how the brain acts as a team of specialists, with different regions responsible for analyzing various features such as color, motion, shape, and sound. These specialists work simultaneously and asynchronously, producing multiple interpretations of incoming data. There is no central editor to synthesize these results into a single, definitive perception. Instead, the brain continuously revises and updates its drafts of sensory information, filtering and selecting what gains prominence. This processing explains phenomena like change blindness and inattentional blindness, where important visual information can go unnoticed because the brain does not incorporate it into the current narrative draft. Our conscious experience is therefore selective and constructed, not a faithful real-time recording of the external world. Dennett also highlights the role of memory in consciousness. Memories are not static records, but active processes that influence perception and interpretation. The brain constantly integrates past experiences with current sensory input, allowing predictions and expectations to shape what we perceive. This blending of memory and perception is crucial for constructing a coherent sense of self and continuity over time. Another key point is that cognition involves multiple competing representations rather than a single authoritative voice. Attention acts as a spotlight that helps select which drafts become dominant, but it is not the seat of consciousness itself. Consciousness emerges from the interplay of many processes rather than from a single privileged source. Dennett discusses how the brain's architecture supports this distributed processing, with neural circuits interacting in ways that allow for flexible, adaptive responses to the environment. This complexity enables the rich, nuanced experiences we associate with consciousness, from basic sensory awareness to complex thoughts and feelings. He also touches on the importance of language and symbolic thought in shaping conscious experience. Language allows humans to create narratives and abstract concepts, enriching the drafts with meaning and facilitating self-reflection and planning. Throughout this section, Dennett reinforces his argument that conscious experience is a process of interpretation and construction, not a passive reception. The brain's ability to generate multiple, overlapping drafts that compete and cooperate explains many features of consciousness that previous models struggled with. This understanding prepares the ground for exploring how the brain creates the sense of a self and how free will fits into the narrative of consciousness, topics addressed in the next section. Dennett delves into the nature of the self and its relationship to consciousness. Building on the multiple drafts model, he challenges the traditional notion of a unified, unchanging self that observes experiences from a singular vantage point. Instead, he proposes that the self is a center of narrative gravity, a concept he borrows from physics, where a center of gravity is an abstract point that helps explain an object's motion without physically existing. Dennett argues that the self is similarly an abstraction, an evolving story constructed by the brain through the ongoing interplay of multiple drafts. This narrative self emerges as the brain integrates memories, sensory inputs, thoughts, and emotions into a coherent sense of identity over time. There is no hidden I separate from these processes. Rather, the self is the story the brain tells about itself. This view explains why our sense of self can change, develop, or even fragment in certain psychological conditions. It also accounts for how we can experience multiple, sometimes conflicting perspectives within our own minds without a fixed central observer. Dennett then explores the implications of this model for free will and moral responsibility. He suggests that free will should not be understood as an absolute metaphysical property, but rather as the capacity to respond flexibly and reflectively within the brain's complex processes. Our ability to generate and revise multiple drafts allows for deliberate choice, self-control, and ethical decision-making. The narrative self enables us to reflect on our actions, imagine alternative futures, and hold ourselves accountable. Dennett argues this practical conception of free will is compatible with a naturalistic, scientific worldview. There is no need for an immaterial soul or a mysterious will separate from brain processes. He also addresses the role of language and storytelling in shaping the self. Human beings create rich, symbolic narratives about their lives, which reinforce the sense of identity and agency. These stories help us make sense of our experiences and project continuity across time. Dennett emphasizes that understanding the self as a narrative center of gravity demystifies many philosophical puzzles about personal identity, consciousness, and agency. It shows that these phenomena arise naturally from the brain's interpretive and constructive activities, rather than requiring supernatural explanations. This approach also aligns with findings in psychology and neuroscience that reveal how flexible and context-dependent our sense of self really is. In the final section, Daniel Dennett explores the broader implications of his theory and addresses common objections to his multiple draft model. He reiterates that his aim is to provide a naturalistic, scientifically grounded explanation of consciousness that avoids the pitfalls of traditional dualism and Cartesian assumptions. Dennett emphasizes that consciousness is not a magical phenomenon, but an emergent property of complex neural processes. He argues that once we discard the idea of a central observer or soul, many philosophical mysteries dissolve. What remains is a rich, dynamic interplay of brain activities, producing the experiences we associate with consciousness. He addresses critiques that the multiple drafts model may seem counterintuitive or at odds with our subjective sense of unity. Dennett acknowledges that our experience feels unified and continuous, but he explains this unity as the result of integration across multiple drafts and the brain's capacity to construct a coherent narrative. Our sense of a seamless self is thus a useful fiction, deeply rooted in neural processes rather than an ontological reality. Dennett also tackles questions about free will, arguing that his model supports a version of free will compatible with determinism. Because the brain's processes are flexible and capable of self-reflection and revision, humans can be seen as responsible agents even if their actions arise from physical causation. Throughout the conclusion, Dennett reflects on the interdisciplinary nature of consciousness studies, encouraging collaboration between philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, and computer science. He sees his work as a step toward a unified science of mind that respects the complexity of brain function while maintaining rigorous philosophical analysis. Dennett expresses optimism that continued research will further illuminate the nature of consciousness, and he invites readers to embrace a scientific approach that is humble, curious, and open to revising its assumptions. In closing, Dennett reminds us that understanding consciousness as an emergent, decentralized process does not diminish its significance. Instead, it reveals the remarkable ways in which the brain constructs our lived reality, weaving together multiple drafts into the rich tapestry of human experience. Thank you for diving into the depths of consciousness with me today. If this journey into the mysteries of the mind sparked your curiosity or brought you new insight, please like, subscribe, and share. Join us again on Mindful Reads, where every book opens a door to greater understanding and mindful living. Until next time, keep exploring, keep reflecting, and keep growing.